And the pilot screamed at me and said, "Oh my God, we're going down." We had a total engine failure. So we basically dropped straight down. It'd be the equivalent of letting a car on a cable go. And we were headed right to the ground.
We impacted a giant oak tree, and I was flung forward. You know, my body was going as fast as the plane was, and then suddenly it wasn't. But my face stopped my body going 100 miles an hour, so I had a severe head injury. My face was torn open from here up to here.
I had my leg sticking out, a hole in the side of the aircraft where the wing had been attached, and with this hand, I was pulling and trying to free myself, but something had caught me, had a hold of my harness and my clothing. And I was trapped inside, soaked with airplane fuel, and on fire from head to toe, literally burning alive. I was blind in my right eye. My skin was so badly burned that my sister described what she saw as like part of my body looked like a hot dog that had fallen into a campfire. It was blackened, crusty, burnt skin. The nerves in both of my legs from the knee down had died, and my feet were withered up like dead bird claws. I was so uncomfortable. There is no pain medicine that could stop this kind of pain. And my oldest sister, her father-in-law was a very prominent surgeon, and he came to see me close to the beginning. I remember vividly, he bent over and he was talking to me. He says, "You just eat everything they put in front of you." And he got up and he put his little hat on and he walked out. And I remember as he was going out, I was beside him going down the hall. And I was wondering, why wasn't he paying attention to me? And I was just wondering that. And then he stepped on the little rubber mat that is an automatic door opener. And all of a sudden, the door, as it opened, it went right through me. My spirit had gone out of my body and was following him. Now, at that time, I'd never heard of anything about out-of-the-body experiences or spiritual things. Hey, I'm just a regular human being who was hot for skydiving. That was my first remembrance of super natural existence or paranormal things. All of a sudden, as soon as that happened, I thought, whoa. And like a bungee cord, my spirit was pulled back into my body. And again, there I was suffering on this in the intensive care unit.
I am Dr. Mike Billigan. I'm here with Dr. Lloyd Rudy, one of the most famous cardiac surgeons.
Once we were able to accomplish the repair of the aneurysm and the replacement of the valve, we could not get the person off of the bypass. We simply couldn't get him off the heart-lung machine. Finally, we just had to give up. I mean, we just said, we cannot get him off of the heart-lung machine, so we're going to have to pronounce him dead. Right. So we did that. The machine that records the blood pressure and the pulse and the left atrial pressure and all the monitoring lines and things continued to run the paper out onto the floor in a big heap. Nobody bothered to turn it off. The assistant surgeon and I in our short sleeve shirts, and we were standing at the door kind of discussing if there was anything else we could have done, any other medicines we could have given, whatever, right, to have made this a success. We put down a transesophageal echo probe, and we can get a beautiful picture on a monitor of the heart beating. Well, that machine was left on, and the tape, the VCR tape, continued to run.
Right.
It had been at least 20 minutes, close to 20, 25 minutes,
right,
that this man recorded no heartbeat, no blood pressure. All of a sudden we looked up and we saw some electrical activity. And pretty soon the electrical activity turned into a heartbeat. Very slow, 30, 40 a minute. And we thought, well, that's kind of an agonal thing. And we see that occasionally, that the heart will continue to beat even though the patient can't generate a blood pressure or pump any blood. Well, pretty soon we look and he's actually generating a pressure. No, we're not doing anything. I mean, the machines are all shut off. So I start yelling, "Get anesthesia back in here and get the nurses." We started giving him some medicines, and anesthesia started giving him oxygen. Pretty soon he had a blood pressure of 80 and soon a blood pressure of 100, and his heart rate was now up to 100 a minute, you know. To make a very long story short, without putting him back on cardiopulmonary bypass, the heart and lung machine, he recovered and had no neurologic deficit. And for the next 10 days, 2 weeks, all of us went in and were talking to him about what he experienced, if anything. And he talked about the bright light at the end of the tunnel. But the thing that astounded me was that he described that operating room floating around and saying, I saw you and Dr. Cattaneo standing in the doorway with your arms folded talking. I didn't know where the anesthesiologist was, but he came running back in. And I saw all of these Post-its sitting on this TV screen. And what those were any call I got, the nurse would write down who called and the phone number and stick it on the monitor, and then the next Post-it would stick to that Post-it, and then I'd have a string of Post-its of phone calls I had to make. He described that. I mean, there's no way he could have described that before the operation because they didn't have any calls. He was up there. Yeah. He described the scene, things that there is no way he knew. Right. I mean, he didn't wake up in the operating room and see all this stuff. I mean, he was out. So what does that tell you? What does that tell you? Was that his soul up there?
So what's your explanation here? And there was a long pause, and then he said, I'll tell you. There are many cardiosurgeons in the world. Nobody would have known the guy. So he made up a story. It's a PR trick. Mm-hmm. I said, Carl, PR trick. A cardiosurgeon makes up a story like this to boost his professional image. Yeah. I mean, he must have hesitated for a couple of years if he could publish that, because he knew he would become a laughingstock for people like you.
I presented this case to 13 other cardiac surgeons throughout the country in a special meeting, and they had several similar experiences, not quite as dramatic as the one I had, but everybody that deals with that every day has had those experiences. So it's not just me.
A stunning array of scientific instruments and measurements were in place at the very moment of Pam Reynolds' death. The results were astonishing. At age 35, Pam was diagnosed with a life-threatening brain aneurysm. Her only hope was a very unusual operation. In order to fix the problem and to save her life, doctors would have to drain the blood out of Pam Reynolds' head. What's more, her body temperature would be lowered to 60 degrees. Her heartbeat and breathing would stop completely, and her brain waves would be flattened. In the case of Pam Reynolds, one of the surgeon's main concerns was seizure activity, which could prove deadly during such a delicate procedure. To guard against this and other complications, Pam's brain and body were extensively instrumented and monitored, which makes what happened next even more intriguing. Pam told the doctors she left her body and became a spectator to what they were doing to her body. Later, she was able to describe people, procedures, and even medical instruments she could not possibly have seen.
Pam Reynolds had a very deep near-death experience at the time that she had documented no brainwave activity, no brainstem activity, and actually the blood had been physically drained from her head at the time. So this eliminates the possibility that this was a seizure phenomenon, because during her experience she had no seizure activity on the EEG. In addition, she had plugs in both of her ears, and so she could not have physically heard what was being discussed in the operating room during the surgical procedure, and she could recall the accurate discussions that were going on between the surgeons at the time that she was having her experience.
Remember, every bodily reflex was being monitored. She was in a profoundly inactive state. But Pam Reynolds somehow was able to describe a particular surgical tool in amazing detail. A tool which she would later say looked like an electric toothbrush with a dent in it. She even noticed that the tool had interchangeable blades and that these were kept in something that she said looked like a socket wrench case.
Dr. Spetzler is happy to report Pam's 10-hour surgery is a success, but he's confounded by what she tells him about her experience.
It struck me that this was incredibly perplexing and not understandable with what we know about the brain. Without any brainwave activity, it is inconceivable to me that the brain can receive, internalize, and maintain a memory.
Till now, the concept was that the brain is the producer of consciousness and the producer of memories. And when you study near-death experience, then you have to say, well, we have to reconsider this concept. And perhaps we should consider the brain not as a producer, but as a receiver of consciousness. And that's a kind of revolution.
Yeah. Well, I'm a cardiologist, so I had the privilege to have patients who survived cardiac arrest. And after reading a book about near-death experiences by George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow, who had a near-death experience as a medical student in '43, I just started out of curiosity to ask patients who survived a cardiac arrest if they could remember something of this period of unconsciousness. And then, to my big surprise, within 2 years, out of 50 patients I asked, 12 patients told me about the near-death experience. And that's the moment my scientific curiosity started to grow, because of, according to our current medical knowledge, it's impossible to experience consciousness during cardiac arrest when circulation and breathing have ceased. We have the assumption, which shouldn't be discussed, that consciousness is a product of the function of the brain. So that's the reason it's impossible to experience consciousness when you have a cardiac arrest. It's a non-proven assumption. It's just an hypothesis, but everybody accepts it. What we did in the Dutch study, we started in '88, with all 344 consecutive patients who survived a cardiac arrest. And from this position, you ask patients if they have to experience something. That 62 patients, 80%, reported a near-death experience. And 282 patients, 82%, did not report a memory. So this is a kind of situation where you know exactly what's going on in the brain. We know exactly that patients were clinical death, which is a period of unconsciousness due to the ceasing of circulation and breathing. And all those patients will die within 5 to 10 minutes if resuscitation is not started. So you can look after all the factors who could explain the causal content of an NDE. This lack of oxygen, or the fear of death, or medication or hallucination or whatever. It was so striking and surprising for us that there is no explanation whatsoever why those 18% of the people have a near-death experience. There's no physiological explanation. The lack of oxygen to the brain is not an explanation at all, because all those 100% of those patients had anoxia of the brain, lack of oxygen. The body reflexes are gone, which is a function of the cortex of the brain. The brainstem reflexes are gone. So the gag reflex or the corneal reflex or the UFC dilated pupils. The breathing center has gone, which is close to the brainstem, so people don't breathe anymore. And when you measure the activity of the brain, which is an EEG, you see after an average of 50 seconds a total flatline.
So I have dozens and dozens of near-death experiences that occurred under general anesthesia, and at this time it should be, if you will, doubly impossible to have a conscious remembrance. There's simply no way you can be under general anesthesia and have a highly lucid, organized experience like that.
So we came to the conclusion that there is no explanation, but the experience is enhanced consciousness during a period of cardiac arrest when the brain is not functioning. So for me, the brain has a function of a transceiver. it receives information from consciousness, and it sends information from our senses and body to our consciousness. It is a transceiver, it's an interface function. So the brain makes it possible, it facilitates the experience of waking consciousness when we are awake. But consciousness itself is not localized to the body and to the brain.
That there are significant correlations between the functioning of the brain and the states of consciousness. Mm-hmm. You have a temporal tumor, your consciousness is changed in a certain way, which is different from having a prefrontal tumor. You know, somebody hits you over the head, you lose consciousness, and so on. Mm-hmm. So we know that there are very, very close correlations, but where the logical jump happened is to see this as a proof that consciousness is actually generated in the brain. Mm-hmm. It would be a saying that because the quality of the program, television program, sound and the picture depends on the functioning of the set, mm-hmm. is a proof that the program is generated in the box.
Right.
So you see, all these observations just showing the correlation, and they leave open the possibility that consciousness is coming from somewhere else, that mm-hmm. the brain is modulated or modulating or mediating mm-hmm. consciousness, but it doesn't really generate it. Arguments against the fact that consciousness is possibly generated in the brain mm-hmm. are these near-death experiences that you mentioned.
Right.
You know, people who have the experience of clinical death and they observe their body from the ceiling, and they...
He was up there.
Yeah.
He described the scene, things that there is no way he knew.
Mm-hmm. They mm-hmm. decide to go and mm-hmm. check what's happening in other parts of the building, or experience something 3,000 miles away. People who are congenitally blind, organically blind, they had never seen anything, they can see when their consciousness...
But they perceive. I say perceive because it's not by your eyes. Your eyes are closed. And you perceive 360 degrees. You can see details and an overview at the same time. So it's a different kind of perception.
And colors I didn't even know exist, you could see them. And I could see, it's like I could see 360 degrees.
Not only do they see something, but you can get consensual validation by people who have the mm-hmm. ability to see.
He described that. I mean, there's no way he could have described that before the operation because they didn't have any calls. I mean, he didn't wake up in the operating room and see all this stuff. I mean, he was out.
They tell what happened to the body during resuscitation is corroborated by doctors and nurses and family members. So they tell, I saw this and also this, and say, well, that's right, it happened really.
All of a sudden, as soon as that happened, I thought, whoa. And like a bungee cord, my spirit was pulled back into my body. And again, there I was suffering on this, in the intensive care unit. And they called in a specialist from one of the most famous hospitals in the United States. And he examined me. And at the end of his summary, he simply wrote, "There is nothing I can offer this young man." And they quit trying to save my life and were just waiting for me to die.
Well, there's a wholeness of life, you know, and there's these years which are important, but there's something else that's called eternity that I was about to get a view of.
And I was shaking so badly. And then suddenly, at the height of all human discomfort, life, it felt like, was ebbing out of me. It was like if there was someone throwing switches inside of my switch box to an off, this organ off, this body function off. I could feel life leaking out of me.
As I laid there shaking in that horrible condition in such pain, and I remember I was wide awake. I can remember as if it happened this morning. My spirit, my inner man, you see, Sid, you are a spirit, you have a soul, and you live in a body. You really are a spirit, you're an eternal spirit.
My spirit left my physical body, not as it did that first experience that I had. I was immediately thrust into a spiritual dimension. I looked and examined myself. I was normal. Everything about this world is more dynamic. Everything, every color is more than colorful. The edges of everything were razor sharp, and the sight and the sensation is so awe-inspiring and so shocking You don't think to try and reason and ask questions. It's total revelatory experience.
The colors in the spirit world are more colorful. Everything's sharper. The emotions, everything. And you don't like logic and reason. That doesn't happen. You just know that you know. It's like having truth automatically all the time.
And colors I didn't even know exist, you could see them. And I could see, it's like I could see 360 degrees. The biggest shock, the most compelling thing that was occurring to me is I instantly understood eternity. See, everything in this life, everything in the creative dimension, everything even as far as telescopes can see that are in the physical plane are related to time. Even if they say it's billions of years, it still has a beginning and an end. Something starts, it stops. Something is new, it gets old. Every living thing that's born will die, but everything in the spirit dimension is everlasting. That struck me, and it was a shock to understand and comprehend eternity.
So everything they experience is at the moment that the brain doesn't function. So it must be somewhere else, and this is what I call the non-local consciousness, where everything is stored. When people tell us about their experience of an enhanced consciousness, and they have a live review of, let's say, during cardiac arrest of 2 minutes, they can talk for hours to days about what experience, because there's no time and no distance during this experience. This consciousness is in a dimension without time and space, and everything is connected. And this is what you call non-locality. So this is what I call non-local consciousness. The concept of non-locality in quantum physics, which has been proven, there's a connection without time, without distance. Two particles are connected instantaneously. There's an interconnectedness, and this is non-local. And this is exactly what people tell us in their near-death experience. So when you accept quantum physics, you can accept the non-local aspects of consciousness as well.
I believe I may have dozed off at the wheel, just briefly. Swerved and overcorrected the car. My rib cage had been crushed, my lungs were collapsing. My right arm had almost been torn off. There was no muscle through the rotator cuff or anything still attaching it. And then the seatbelt had cut through my midsection and ruptured my intestines. In that horror and mayhem, suddenly there was calmness. And I thought, have I lost consciousness? What has happened here? I felt this calmness, and it didn't feel like everything going black like you see in the cartoon. It was as if everything became light. It felt as if I was surrounded by light. It was tangible. And it's as if this light was alive, like it was comforting me, and I began to rise above the scene of this accident. I felt all of it, except in a very, very supersensory way. It was far more real than this realm even. And yet every time I had a question, it's like the answer would come.
It's like having truth automatically all the time.
You have real new thoughts, new emotions during this near-death experience, when the brain doesn't function at all. You have the possibility of perception out and above your body when the brain is not functioning. People tell me that this was more real than ever, but they experienced it during their life. They tell us, I felt home. It's where I come from. This is more real than ever.
Being there and thinking, oh, this is so familiar. I'm home. It did feel as if that's where I came from. It was almost like revisiting my mom's kitchen when she's baking fresh bread and I'm a little boy and I'm so loved and everything's perfect and good. And it felt very much as if I was returning. I experienced it as a return to home.
People came to the conclusion that they are not their bodies. And so they start looking at their body as something that they are using or that they inhabit temporarily. But their identification was something much larger. They don't see death as the end of everything.
Well, I have no fear of death. That's, it's like I've been there, done that, and it was actually a beautiful transition.
They don't have fear of death anymore. Death seemed to be not death at all. So there's a continuity of consciousness, and you see your body, lifeless body, somewhere down, and you feel alive.